So understanding ourselves, I think, is by far the most potent gift of astrology. And if we understand ourselves, then we're, in much greater command of, of our reactions and our responses to life as they happen.
Well, hello and welcome to another episode of Finding Equilibrium. I'm delighted to be here, delighted that you're here. And my guest today is Benjamin Haynes. Benjamin is the founder and director of The Medicine Man, an Ayurvedic practitioner, a professional astrologer, and a brand strategist. So welcome, Benjamin. How are you today?
I'm well, thank you. Thanks for the intro.
It looks like you're in the dispensary today. Am I right? That looks some very interesting packages behind you.
Yeah, all the herbal medicines in the background. Yeah, beautiful environment to work from.
So cool. So one of the things I really wanted to talk to you about today was astrology. So many of us are going through a lot of change. In fact, we're all going through a huge amount of change. And I know you speak about astrology as a tool that can really help us cope through change and help us build resilience. But before we get into that, it'd be really helpful just so that everyone's on the same page, so we understand what astrology is and specifically how it differs from astronomy.
Well, I think the interesting point around that, maybe to begin with, is that at a certain point in time, astronomy and astrology weren't two separate things. Astronomy is the measurement of the physical bodies in space, and astrology was the meaning of that and how that impacted events here on Earth. And so there was a time in our own history, and not even that long ago, that the movement of the heavens weren't divorced from the meaning of the heavens, from our perspective here on Earth. And, I think in that same kind of era of thinking, we were the center of God's creation, and so we were certainly very much impacted by, what was happening in the rest of the cosmos.
Interesting.
In terms of how they differ now, of course, then it's just, that the interpretation of those celestial bodies and their movements is separated out from how that affects us here on Earth.
Cool. And what inspired you to become a professional astrologer in the first place? When did that journey begin?
I think that the journey with astrology probably began when I was maybe 16 or 17 and sent away for my chart. I had my accurate birth time, and there was an advertisement in the local paper or something to that effect that was talking about an astrologer based in the rocks here in Sydney that was offering free charts. And so I sent away to get my chart, delineated and sent back. It wasn't an in-person consultation. It was just, a printout. And I was astounded at the accuracy of that chart and how someone that had never met me could possibly know such things. And so that probably, piqued my interest in the early years, but it was many years that that passed between that experience and when I formally studied astrology. And then, many years again after that I then began offering that service to other people.
Wow, that's so interesting. So maybe if we dig into it, so there are so many different things that we can talk about when it comes to astrology. But given the situation we're all in at the moment and the need to build resilience so that we can cope through the changes that we're all experiencing, how can astrology, from a practical point of view, really help us become more resilient?
I guess, there's a number of aspects to answering that question. I imagine that one of the most, potent ones is to understand oneself. And, I think one of the real gifts of astrology from my perspective is that it creates an objective understanding of what is otherwise a purely subjective experience of life. And so, over the course of our lives, often, many of us find that there are certain repeating patterns that we seem to consistently attract, whether that's, problems with authority figures at work or, particular types of relationships, in our personal lives that we seem to just have a certain type of person that keeps coming in. And oftentimes I think, those experiences are we create them, we attract them. We keep choosing the same types of situations to, involve ourselves in order to learn something, and I think that process can be very slow if it just requires us to repeat a pattern until we become consciously aware of it. Whereas I think with astrology, you have the opportunity to view that pattern in an objective way. And so you kind of are able to sit sort of further back and view it from a slightly different perspective that allows us to, discuss that and understand that in a way that is, very personal, without necessarily triggering us in the same ways that, we might be triggered if that dynamic were to play out, with other people. So understanding ourselves, I think, is by far the most potent gift of astrology. And if we understand ourselves, then we're, in much greater command of, of our reactions and our responses to life as they happen. And so part of what it can show us is, where we have, triggers and shadow aspects of ourselves that might play out, over the course of challenging times. But it also shows us our strengths and our gifts that can be tapped into during challenging times. And so I think, that certainly from that perspective, there's, very few things out there that are as tailored and bespoke as, a personalized astrology chart based on your time, date, and place of birth.
That's so interesting. I mean, all of the throughout this wellness program, we've been talking about unleashing your superheroes, finding your own superpowers, and bringing those out in the world. And what you say around astrology is that it can really help you identify what those superpowers are, because many of us may not know what our strengths are, and we've become more focused on what we're lacking rather than what gifts we have to the world. And so you can find those superpowers, let's say, or find those strengths simply by having your chart read.
Absolutely, assuming that you have an accurate time of birth. And also, assuming that you have a qualified and, talented astrologer working with you, because, I think it's fair to say a lot of people have had negative experiences, with psychics and these sorts of things in the past. And in many ways, I wouldn't necessarily even put astrology in the same camp as, psychics and clairvoyance, because it isn't really relying on psychic abilities in order to delineate a chart. It's far more pragmatic, I guess, in many ways than that. And so, it's certainly a very helpful tool in the hands of, a competent practitioner.
Cool. So we talked about that power of self-knowledge, which makes complete sense. So that helps you pull up or bring your strengths to any challenging situation. What else? What other ways could astrology help to boost resilience?
I think, the old expression "forewarned is forearmed," and that is certainly one of the things that astrology can be helpful for. And so what I mean by that is that, during a consultation with an astrologer, one of the things that you can take a look at is what we call progressions and transits. And they are simply ways of understanding where we're at in terms of the broader cycles that play out in our lives. And so if you can see that coming down the track for a person is a challenging time, and that would be shown by particular planets in particular configurations that as an astrologer you're trained to recognize and understand. If you can see that these things are coming, then you can start to be prepared for those times. So if some of those challenging dynamics are likely to happen around your financial, we call it a house, where your financial matters are shown in the chart, then you can start to perhaps be a little bit careful with your money, start to put some aside in the lead up to that, knowing that there's the possibility that down the track, and we could also be looking at the timing of that, that this type of challenge might be presenting itself in the coming months. And so that's just a very simple example of how that could how that can play out.
Okay, so we can see challenging times coming, so we can prepare ourselves for those stormy seas. How specific is the information that comes through? Like, would it be quite general to say, okay, there looks like there's some challenges around the areas of money, picking up on your point before, or is it very specific? how would you communicate those challenging periods to a person?
I think, possibly that will differ depending, on the astrologer and their own proclivities. Personally, I prefer to work in somewhat more general terms because there's no guarantees. There's no guarantees that a person is going to experience something in a particular way, despite the fact that there might be factors suggesting that that's, the likely outcome. And so, I never deal in absolutes because I think we all have, the ability to change outcomes and to influence those things. So if, for example, somebody was prepared for a difficult financial time that was coming up, then their experience of that might not be particularly challenging because they were prepared for that. Whereas if it came out of the blue and somebody had, overexerted themselves from a financial perspective, in the months leading up to that kind of a crisis period, then it might be a really traumatic experience. And so from my perspective, I think I tend to talk about the energy dynamics that are coming up or that are playing out and the different ways that might be experienced by a person. And then, depending on the character of the individual that you're working with, then they're going to, kind of work with that information in ways that feels appropriate for them. So I think it's definitely, it's a two-way between the astrologer and the person that their client they're talking with. So
that makes sense. So what else from a resilience point of view? So we've said that astrology can help us understand ourselves. Astrology can help us look to the future and see what icebergs, let's say, are coming up. Anything else that astrology can help us with our focus on resilience?
Certainly, I think there's also if it helps us understand where we're at, as I was saying, in sort of broader cycles. And so if you find yourself in a period of intense, conflict or challenge or transformation or difficulty, it helps you to understand where you're at within that particular cycle. And so you can understand how long that's likely to last. And knowing that is really helpful because so often, during a difficult time, you might be tempted to give up or to, just do something different when actually you might be very close to achieving the outcome that you were hoping for. And so if you know where you're at within that process, it can be really helpful just to either, to pace yourself for that journey, I suppose. So if you're in it for the long haul, if it's a 3-year cycle and it's only just begun, knowing that there's another 2 years where there might be a particular type of challenge presenting itself to you means that you can be prepared, psychologically and emotionally prepared for that period of time. But likewise, if you're right near the end of it and you're just about to give it all up and you're about to give up the fight and whether that's a legal battle or something else, it's handy to know that actually things are going to be culminating or resolving, within the next, few weeks or months. And so that can be a really big thing for people when they're in the midst of trial.
Yeah, massive. I mean, that's huge. So it's good to know there's a light at the end of the tunnel. I think what you say so often when things are very challenging, you do just want to give up, but it can help you understand and make sure you're supported in the right way.
Yes.
Anything else? Anything else from a resilience perspective?
Again, I think it all comes back to conscious understanding of what's happening. Because so often we're on the receiving end of what seems to be external dynamics and events that might be taking place, and so we can see ourselves as victims of that. Or we could find ourselves very confused by that. And that state of confusion is very disempowering. And, it impacts us psychologically and emotionally in, really kind of deep ways. And so part of what astrology can also offer is an understanding of the dynamics of what's actually taking place. And so if you understand what the dynamics are in this broader archetypal universal language that astrology sort of brings to our awareness, if you understand the dynamics of what's happening, it can help you to either align yourself with those dynamics in a more harmonious way so that you're not kind of pushing uphill when actually what you need to be doing is surrendering. It shows you what aspect of your life is is undergoing transformational change. And so while it might be impacting your finance, the root of what's actually going on might be actually to do with dynamics around your workplace. And so maybe it's actually around authority figures and how you deal and manage with that. And so understanding what's happening can help you to be more conscious in your response and your participation within those dynamics, rather than simply reacting or being the victim or being confused by what's taking place around you.
That's so interesting. So practically, how do people really benefit from astrology? So we've talked about having your own birth chart read, and beyond that, understanding progressions and things like that. But how would one of your clients or yourself use astrology in a practical way to help support your journey through life, and to ensure that you're resilient and feel supported?
I think a huge part of it is self-acceptance. And I think that is, desperately lacking in so many of us, whether we really recognize that or not. Accepting ourselves for who and how we are goes a long way to resolving a lot of the small tensions that play out in our lives, and within ourselves, and therefore, we're kind of attracted, and reflected in the world around us. Self-acceptance is an enormous part of the healing that can take place through astrological work, with a qualified and sensitive practitioner. But it also means that you can accept other people as well, because we find ourselves at odds with others at varying times in our lives. And so inevitably it comes down to a right or wrong, I'm right, you're wrong kind of perspective. And I think when you can elevate your perspective on life in general to that more archetypal, universal perspective on things, there's very few things really that are right or wrong in the context of most of our lives and the way that we're living. But there are, equally valid but different perspectives on things. And so if you can understand those different perspectives, then it allows you to communicate differently for a start, because you may not be coming then from a defensive place. You can explain your point of view, but you can also validate somebody else's point of view. Doesn't mean that you necessarily have to agree, but at least you get to a point where you can understand each other. There's a mutual understanding there. And that changes the dynamics of how things play out.
Completely, yes. No, I love what you say about no right or wrong. It gives you that much more objective perspective, and helps you understand, why people are the way they are, and you don't feel this need to change them. So
yeah, and then it comes down to more about compatibilities. These are these two different perspectives on this same issue, but they might be incompatible. And so then that becomes a different discussion to go, okay, well then what are we going to do? Because fundamentally we have different, ideas about this, but we're both equally validated within that. And that's the game changer.
And astrology can help with that as well. So if there are challenging relationships between people, then astrology can highlight the reasons why there are challenges, but also give you some guidance as to how to work with those people that might be challenging to us personally.
Absolutely, because so often, the issues are around communication breakdowns. And usually that's because we just don't understand what somebody else is, we don't understand their perspective. And if you do understand it, again, it doesn't mean you have to agree with it, but being able to understand where somebody's coming from takes you out of combat with that person or victimization, dynamics with that person, and into an even playing field where we just, can have a conversation about something that we've got really different perspectives on.
So interesting. What would you say? I mean, a lot of people, astrology's had an interesting history, because it's been around for a long time, and every culture has experienced different types of astrology. But there's a lot of skeptical people out there. So what would you say to someone who is skeptical and thinks, where's the evidence? Those types of questions. What would you say to those people?
I would say that skepticism is good. Skepticism is healthy. I think you do need to be discerning in terms of the people that you choose to, spend your money with and open yourself, in this particular way, which is, very personal. And so I think discernment is really good. I think it can become a barrier. It can become a negative thing when you absolutely shut your mind to something that you haven't, invested any time in trying to understand or, research properly. I think there's, very few things in this world that last as long, for, 10,000 years or more. Nothing lasts that long if there isn't something to it. Entire civilizations have come and gone in the same period of time, and yet astrology and the knowledge around that continues. There's a reason that continues. It doesn't mean that every astrologer that you read in the newspaper or that you see advertised somewhere is gifted and worthy of your time and money and attention. But if you can find one that is, it is incredibly valuable. And it is a tool that is unlike any other if it's given the respect and study that's required in order to really understand it.
And where would you find a trusted astrologer? Because I agree with you that there are lots of people out there who may not may not have the skill and can cause more damage with their words. But how would you select? So for someone who's listening to this, who's inspired by what you've said and is curious and open to at least exploring this area, but nervous because you're dabbling in something which is unknown and different, where would you guide that person in terms of finding an astrologer who can help them?
I think, word of mouth is probably one of the best options. So if you know of somebody that's been to someone that, really kind of, impacted them in a positive way, that's a great place to start, because, word of mouth is the best way of kind of getting the benefit of others. So that would be a really great place to start. I think the other place you can look at, there are governing bodies, even though they are kind of self-regulated. There are governing bodies in different countries that, ensure that astrologers have a certain amount of training behind them. And so that would also be a really good thing, is to look at the qualifications of the person that you're potentially considering going to see. And then outside of that, it's to use your own discernment. If you can have a conversation with that person, if you're able to speak with them on the phone to get a sense of, does this person feel as though they communicate in a way that makes sense to me? Does it feel as though you resonate with them energetically? I think those things are all important. I imagine there might be a degree that if you're meant to find somebody, then that might, cross your path at some point, in the future anyway. But certainly if you're starting to feel interested, if you're starting to feel that kind of that calling, that can be that little bit of a stirring in the soul. And those things often lead to interesting outcomes. It doesn't mean that the journey is always going to be, straight and easy. And so it might mean that you come across, people that are, a bit shady along the way, but, never give up your own empowerment. And no matter what anybody else tells you, I think you are your own greatest authority. And so you want to always maintain that sovereignty throughout, life in general, let alone, these kind of areas. But yeah, I think there's a bit of trust and things that you'll find the right people when you need to.
When you need to, yes. Wow. And last question, just around the different types of astrology, because you've got Vedic, Western, China, lots of different types. Is there a difference? Like what would a Vedic astrologer give a different interpretation, for example, to a Western astrologer?
There are differences. I guess in some regards, they are all interpreting, celestial events, here on terrestrial Earth. And so, they have a common thread, all of them. They come from different cultures, and so they're influenced by the nature of those cultures. And so depending on what it is that you're looking to find from your, astrological questioning, then they may be more or less suited, to that particular, branch of questioning. The modern Western astrology tends to be very choice-centered. So it's less fated and fatalistic in the way that it's presented. And so they call it more psychological astrology. And so it's understanding the dynamics, similar to the things we've been talking about today, understanding the dynamics that are at play around you, how you interact with that, how you participate in more conscious ways. And so Western astrologers will tend to often be quite choice-centric. But again, depending on the type of astrology they practice, because there are techniques that require the good and bad omens or signs within the chart, not your birth chart, within the chart that you cast for the question somebody's asked. And it's handy in those regards that Mars is bad or Saturn is bad, or that means no, because people in those instances might be looking for yes or no. Will I get this job? Should I take this this opportunity? And so in those regards, it can be helpful to have something a bit more definitive. But generally speaking, I think you'll find that most Western astrologers are more choice-centered, that these are the dynamics, that are at play within this particular avenue versus this particular avenue. But as I say, they've all got their pros and cons. And I think that if you were to have a reading with a Vedic astrologer, a Chinese astrologer, and a Western astrologer, you would get great value from all of those different systems. They would have their own nuances that would lead to incredible insight for you personally. Or they might be expressed in particular ways that resonate with you more. And so, having them all, I think, can be valuable. But if you only have the chance, opportunity, or finances to see one, then you go with the one that kind of, calls to you the most.
Interesting. And seeing clients, are there typical questions that people come to you with seeking answers? Like, are people asking about, I don't know, relationships or jobs, or a combination of all of those? Have you seen a pattern of questioning coming through recently?
It's interesting. I mean, I think, people are often interested in those things. So they might come seeking answers to, is there a love interest coming, or is there something, to that effect, or, around their work, money, work, relationships. Those are usually the big things that people feel, because they're the things that are impacting us, most immediately often. But generally, I find that what people leave with is a greater understanding of themselves. And so, their soul kind of journey. And, that is so much more valuable in many ways than any of the smaller terrestrial kind of mundane questions, we call them. Because whether there's a relationship coming up or not, whether there's a lover coming in at a particular point in time, what's more important to understand is what you're like within relationships, and where there might be shadows that play out within your relationship dynamics, or the kind of person that would be really compatible with you within a relationship, so that when you come across these things, if you find yourself in a relationship, you don't just repeat the same self-sabotaging pattern that you might have in the past, because having a relationship isn't necessarily what might be important. It's how you have a healthy, fulfilling relationship. And so if a lover's coming on or out, actually is probably secondary to whether or not you can understand how to have a fulfilling, healthy relationship when it does come.
Cool. That's really, really interesting. And where can people find out more about you? Because I know you do consultations, you do readings with clients, and you do those via Zoom. So effectively, people can have a reading with you from anywhere in the world. And how do people get in touch with you?
So probably the easiest way is via the website, which is themedicineman.com.au. I would say that's probably the easiest place to start. You can make bookings online, or you can email, and we can always book something in. Otherwise, they can look in their own local area, or they can start to do a bit of research around that. Look at the reviews and those sorts of things. If you're going to someone for the first time, that might also help just to make their decisions around, who you feel drawn to.
Cool. Well, thank you, Benjamin. Let me acknowledge you for all the work you do. It's amazing work. I know you've helped so many people to understand themselves and help them get guidance and clarity during these changing times. And I think there's nothing more powerful than self-knowledge, because that really does help you feel resilient and help you feel that you can cope no matter what's happening around you. So thank you so much for spending time with us today. Enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you everyone for listening.